Hi, this is Mato. Welcome to my online chess lecture. In this video I will show you a game between Anthony Miles and Artur Yusupov. This game was played in Serbia in 1980. Since this video is all about the Indian strategy, let's go straight to the position of our interest. This is the position. Who is better? White has a better pawn structure. Black has double pawns on the d file, but at the moment white can't get even close to them. Black is in the control of the open c file. Maybe it is white to move. Before doing anything special, Miles decided to prevent the invasion on the second rank, and he played knight to e1, rook to b4, f3, preventing knight to e4, and also intending king to f2, g5, intending g4, g4, rook to b3, king to f2, king to g7, h3, h5. White to move. Is there a way for white to make any progress? Miles played a very cool move. Rook to a3. Rook takes rook, pawn takes rook. White is intending rook to b2. But now rook to c3, threatening rook takes pawn on a3. Rook to a2. Well, if rook to b2, rook takes on a3, rook takes on b6, rook to a2 check, and white can't climb an advantage. Back to our game. So rook to a2 is the best move. h4. Black is planning at some stage to capture the white pawn on h3 and to create a passed pawn. Deep thinking. King to e2. Rook to c1. If the knight moves, black intends rook to h1. Knight to d3. Lucky Yusupov didn't have to wait for too long. Rook to h1. This is a very interesting moment of the game. Some players with the white pieces would simply play knight to f2, especially if they are low on time. Anthony Miles played rook to b2. This is quite a move, daring black to take on h3. This move required some deep calculations because of the risk involved. Well, if white is not careful, black may even win. Black to move. Rook to a1. Let's take it back. If rook takes on h3, one line goes like this. Knight to f2. Rook to g3. Rook takes on b6, creating a passed pawn. h3. Rook to b1, h2, a4. Rook to g1, and now rook to f1. After knight to e8, intending to prevent white pawn from reaching a8 square. a5, after knight to c7, knight to h1. Check. Rook to f2, rook to g1, rook takes on h2, rook to a1, rook to h5, f6, knight to g3, and white stands better. Please note, this is just one line, and there are branches of this variation. It is quite mind-boggling. Back to our game. Rook to a1, intending to capture the potentially dangerous white pawn. The game continued. Rook takes on b6, rook takes on a3, rook takes on d6. Finally, white captured the weak pawn on d6 and stands better. But the battle is not over yet. Rook to a2, king to f1, rook to a1 check. Let's take it back. What happens if rook to a3, attacking the knight and extraying the pawn on e3? This is what Miles had in mind. Knight to b4. And now if rook takes on e3, then what happens then? Then rook takes knight on f6. And after king takes knight, knight takes on d5. Check, forking the king and the rook. Back to our game. Rook to a1 check, knight to e1, rook to a3, knight to c2, rook to a2, knight to b4, rook to a5, king to e2, rook to b5, knight to d3, rook to a5, rook to b6, rook to a2, rook to b2, pawn up. White would be happy to trade rooks. Rook to a1, knight to e5, intending rook to b7, rook to a7, rook to b5, rook to a2 check, king to d3, rook to a7. Let's take it back. If black continues with checks, then one line goes like this: king to c2, check, king to c3, check, king to b4, rook to a7, king to c5, and white is much better. Back to our game. Rook to a7, king to c3, rook to c7 check, rook to c5, rook to b7, rook to a5, king to f8, rook to a6, attacking the knight, knight to e8, but this allows e4. Knight to c7, attacking the rook, rook to a5, f6, knight to c6, d takes on e4, f takes on e4, knight to e6, on the way to f4 and h3, creating a passed pawn. Yusupov is not giving up. Rook to f5, king to g7, e5, pawn takes pawn on e5, rook takes on e5, knight to f4, attacking the pawn on h3. How to defend the pawn? What would you do? Yusupov played rook takes on g5. Let's take it back. Rook to e3 is not a good idea because of knight to d5 check, and black wins. Back to our game. Rook to g5 check, king to h8, d5, knight takes on h3, creating a passed pawn, attacking the rook, rook to f5, king to g7, knight to d8, rook to a7, knight to e6 check, king to g8. White played a move and black resigned, and the move is g5. Yusupov resigned. For the entertainment purpose, I will show you just one line. Knight to g1, g6, rook to a8, g7, h3, rook to f8 check, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, queen, check, king to h7, queen to g7, check, mate. Wow, that was an epic endgame. And let's go back to our training position. This is the position white to move. Can you win with white pieces from this position? Please click on the link below the video and test your endgame skills against the Terminator. Good luck! And that is all. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I wish you good luck with your chess, and bye for now.